Okay, my talk today is on the most influential paper in the field of human memory by far. It's a chapter written by Atkinson-Shiffrin in 1968 called Human Memory, a Proposed System and Its Control Processes. This chapter guided research into human memory in the years after it was published, and it's still doing that to this day. According to Google Scholar, it's been cited more than 16,000 times and is incredibly still cited about 700 times a year. And I don't care how famous you are, I doubt you have a paper that's cited even half that often, much less one that you wrote decades ago. So this is a uniquely influential paper, and it's why we're still talking about it today. Okay, let me zoom in on it a little bit here. This chapter drew a distinction between the structural features of the memory system and control processes in the memory system. The structural features are the hardwired aspects of memory that are sort of built in, and the control processes are processes that are used at the discretion of the subject. So if I gave you a list of words, you could choose to rehearse them or not in an effort to memorize them. So rehearsal is an example of a control process. Everybody knows that part of the story. The purpose of my talk today is to point out something that is not widely appreciated, which is that the way this model is characterized in textbooks and sometimes research articles is incorrect. You'll often see it said that this model seemed to provide an accurate account of how memory works in the years after it was published, but has since been proven wrong. But when you read how these textbook writers describe how it's been proven wrong, they themselves get it wrong. And I just want to explain how I think that misconception came to be and why it makes sense to correct the record. After all, this is our field's most influential paper by a lot. It seems reasonable to suggest that it be characterized more accurately going forward, and that's the purpose of my talk today. And I want to begin by pointing out that I'm not the first one to notice that there's a discrepancy between how this model is characterized in textbooks and what Atkinson and Shiffrin actually said. So here's a quote from a paper by Nelson Cowan and his colleagues published way back in year 2000. Here's what they said. Nevertheless, Atkin-Shiffrin was so widely cited in textbooks that we had the misleading impression that we knew what was in the chapter, a description of the modal model. The Atkinson-Shiffrin model is often referred to as the modal model. Actually, it was more like an illusion of knowing. And I know what they're talking about because I had an illusion of knowing about what was in the Atkinson-Shiffrin chapter for many years. In fact, I'm embarrassed to admit how far I was into my career before I finally read their chapter. I mean, but after all, why would I? I already knew what was in it. All the textbooks say the same thing, so I know what's in it. And I can't even remember why I finally sat down to read it. But when I did, I was really surprised, like as they were, by what I found. I realized I had an illusion of knowing. And I realized that everybody has an illusion of knowing. And for the same reason, just like me, nobody's reading their chapter. And so today what I want to do is show you how the model is characterized in textbooks. And then together, we're going to read the chapter and see what Atkinson-Shiffrin really said. And I hope you find it interesting and enlightening. But before I do that, let me describe what the textbooks get right, like the basics of the Atkinson-Shiffrin model. And with the various hardwired components there in color-coded, the sensory register, the short-term store, and the long-term store. Those are the structural features of memory. And I just want to tell you briefly, why they thought it was important to draw a distinction between these three types of memory. Taken one at a time. What was their reasoning? Let's start with the sensory register. And basically, this is what they said about that. The prime example of a sensory register is the short-term visual image investigated by Sperling in the early 1960s. And probably most of you who are listening to this talk know about this, but let me just briefly describe it anyway. The task that was being used at the time was they would flash a matrix, an array of letters like this. And then the subject would be asked to report back as many letters as they could. And it's a really hard task, and they would get maybe 3 or 4 correct. And so it seemed like they weren't, when I flashed something like that, you're not getting all of that information into your memory, into any kind of memory, because you can only get 3 or 4 items. But Sperling thought maybe the entire image is getting into memory, like a photographic memory, an icon that lasts only for a few hundred milliseconds. And the reason why people are only getting 3 or 4 is because as they're reading from their iconic image in their brain, it's fading away rapidly. So by the time they get to the 4th item, it's gone and they can't read the rest of them. And so to see if that might be true, he came up with his ingenious partial report method where he would flash this matrix of letters, and after it was gone, he would unpredictably cue one of the rows for the subject to report back. And if he did that right after the image was gone, they could report back the entire row flawlessly every time. And so that indicated to Sperling and to everybody else that there really is an iconic image stored in a sensory register, and it lasts for a few hundred milliseconds. Certainly not the only kind of memory we have, but that's one kind, and that's the first structural component, the sensory register. Then they drew a distinction between short-term store and long-term store, which at the time, you know, a lot of people thought we don't really need to draw that distinction. Even today, some people will make that argument that we don't need to do that. But they had a reason for doing it. And what was that reason? Well, it was patient HM, the most famous patient in neuropsychology. And here's this famous paper in 1957 by surgeon William Scoville and experimental psychologist Brenda Milner. And it's a paper about patient HM who suffered from intractable epilepsy. And to treat that disorder, the surgeon removed his medial temporal lobes bilaterally, including the hippocampus. And it did help with the epilepsy, but it left him profoundly amnesic. And Brenda Milner is the one who studied his memory functioning, what was preserved, what was lost. And she found that he basically can't get any new information into long-term store. It's just, he's not going to learn anything new from that day forward. But other types of memory seem to be preserved, and I'm going to tell you what she found out in the early 1960s as she was studying this patient. But before I do, I just want to briefly mention a news article that I came across. This is from July 15th, 2024. Look at the title of that article. At 106 years old, neuroscientist Brenda Milner is still unlocking the mysteries of the brain. That's amazing. And the only concession she makes to her pretty advanced age is that she's no longer taking postdocs. So, yeah, she's inspirational in many ways, this way, but also the work she did with patient HM. So here's what she said in a paper back in 1966. The immediate registration of new input, as measured, for example, by digit span and dichotic listening tests, appears to take place normally, and material which can be encompassed by verbal rehearsal is held for many minutes. So this image on the screen, that red areas show what was bilaterally removed and caused him to be amnesic in the sense that he can't get any information into his long-term store. But this other type of memory, you know, you read him some digits, 573914, and he could repeat them back to you and hold on to them and rehearse them indefinitely. That's a type of memory that seems to be pretty much preserved. And that was the reasoning that Atkinson-Shiffrin gave in their 1968 chapter for why it makes sense to draw a distinction between short-term store and long-term store. Yeah, he can't get anything into long-term store, but there's another kind of memory that he can get information into and can keep it alive as long as he's rehearsing it. That seems like a different type of memory. And that reasoning makes a lot of sense to this day. And to illustrate it in a little more detail, let me show you this clip of another patient, patient EP, who was studied by my colleague here at UCSD, Larry Squire, who is a lot like patient HM. Patient EP also had bilateral medial temporal lobe damage, complete damage, and he was a complete amnesic. And he sort of illustrates what I was just talking about, and this video taken from public broadcasting is still on the web, and you can find it. So let's look at this first clip. I have two clips. This first one shows just how amnesic patient EP is. He cannot get information into his long-term store.
How have you been enjoying this?
I enjoy this.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
It is interesting, isn't it?
Look at the work you guys are doing. You're getting wonderful, I believe.
I'm sorry, I forget her name. What's her name?
Her name?
Yeah.
I don't remember.
Okay, Jennifer.
Jennifer.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Have you met Jennifer before today?
I think so, yes. I'm not positive though.
Yeah. That's
I'm sorry,
No.
Oh, that's
It's
okay.
okay.
Yeah.
We all have.
well, we all get that one.
Oh, sure. How much have you worked with him?
We have probably visited his house 200 times.
Okay, that's amnesia. Jennifer has been to that house 200 times, been introduced to patient EP 200 times. He still doesn't know her name and is still not even sure if he's ever met her before. He cannot get information encoded into his long-term store. Okay. But now let's look at the second clip.
And he not only has no difficulty repeating back a list of words, in this case, dog, raccoon, lion, and parrot,
Dog, raccoon, lion, and a parrot.
Good.
Okay, he sort of he can't get anything into his long-term store, but he effortlessly got a few words into something, some kind of memory, got in there, got into his brain. He could keep it alive by rehearsal if he wanted to. And that's why Atkinson and Shiffrin quite reasonably just said there, not only is there the sensory register, there are two types of memory, short-term store and long-term store in addition to that, and their reasoning makes a lot of sense to this day. All right, so that's their motto. Now let's get back to how it's characterized and the illusion of knowing. And I'm just going to quote from one modern textbook, not even going to say who the authors are because it doesn't matter. The textbooks tend to describe it this way in general. Here's a quote from that modern textbook. Atkinson and Shiffrin created a mathematical simulation of their model concentrating on the processes involved in rote rehearsal of verbal items and on the role of rehearsal in the transfer of information from the short-term store to the long-term store. For a while, the modal model seemed to offer a neat solution to the question of how information is manipulated and stored. Before long, however, problems began to appear. And now, after having read the chapter, I want to say, hey, wait a second, before you tell me about the problems, I have a problem with what you just said. And so, for example, you just said it's a model of rote rehearsal, and you said of verbal items, and I'm saying that's not right. And if you don't realize that, you're going to think the model has been disproven. And so let's focus on the first one there, I call the rote rehearsal myth. And what do they say about that? One problem concerned the assumption that simply holding items in the short-term store for long enough, that's rote rehearsal, would guarantee learning. This view was challenged by Craik and Lockhart in 1972, who proposed instead the principle of levels of processing, which maintains that learning depends on the way in which material is processed rather than time in short-term store. So it's how you process information that gets it into a long-term store, such as if you semantically analyze, that's deep processing of the information, it gets it into long-term store, not just rote rehearsal. So this overturned or is inconsistent with the Atkinson-Shiffrin model according to this textbook. But let's read what Atkinson-Shiffrin actually said. Now we'll together read from their chapter, starting with a quote that makes it at first sounds like they're saying all you have to do is echo words mindlessly in your short-term store, and the longer you do that, the more you're going to get this great long-term memory. Here's what they said. Transfer from short-term store to long-term store may be considered a permanent feature of memory. Any information in short-term store is transferred to long-term store to some degree throughout its stay in short-term store. Okay, that sounds like they're saying rote rehearsal is the royal road to long-term store. But let's keep reading. The important aspect of this transfer, however, is the wide variance in the amount and form of the transferred information that may be induced by control processes. When the subject is concentrating upon rehearsal, they mean rote rehearsal, the information transferred would be in a relatively weak state and easily subject to interference. What they're saying there is rote rehearsal doesn't work very well, consistent with what people would later conclude. On the other hand, the subject may divert his effort from rehearsal to various coding operations, which will increase the strength of the stored information. That works better. They're talking about coding operations and coding processes that work a lot better. What is a coding process? In answer to the question of what is a coding process, we can most generally state that a coding process is a select alteration and or addition to the information in short-term store as a result of a search of the long-term store. This change may take a number of forms, often using strong pre-existing associations already in long-term store. So what they're saying is, these associations, these are semantic associations. If you make contact with those while you're rehearsing, you're going to make a much better memory trace. So they're describing levels of processing theory, basically. So this is a description of what we now call deep semantic processing, also referred to as elaborative rehearsal, which is more effective than what we now call shallow processing, or maintenance or rote rehearsal. These are terms that we now use. So far from contradicting the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, the very findings that are presented as contradicting the Atkinson-Shiffrin model actually confirm what was proposed in that chapter in 1968. Yeah, that could be corrected going forward. And so why do people get it wrong? And I'm not 100% sure, but when I read other sections in the chapter, I think I see hints about why people might have missed the message in their chapter. So let's read this passage. This rehearsal serves the purpose of increasing the strength built up in a long-term store, both by increasing the length of stay in short-term store, during which time a trace is built up in long-term store, and by giving coding and other storage processes time to operate. Indeed, almost any kind of operation on an array of information, such as coding, can be viewed as a form of rehearsal, but this paper reserves the term only for the duration lengthening repetition process. So they could have used coding processes, semantic analysis. They could have used a term like elaborative rehearsal for that. They could have called that rehearsal, they're saying. They could have called that. But instead, they're just for purposes of this chapter, they're going to use the term rehearsal to refer to the duration lengthening process. And I think maybe people have misinterpreted that to mean, duration lengthening rehearsal is all there is to encoding information into long-term store. But that's clearly not what they were saying. So to summarize, Atkinson and Shiffrin in their 1968 chapter explicitly described the essence of levels of processing theory. So the subsequent levels of processing sort of revolution did not contradict their model. It's the opposite. It confirmed what they were saying. And I think this has been overlooked because they use different terminology, coding processes, and because their specific models focused on the duration lengthening process of rehearsal. As best I can tell, that's why it has been misunderstood. All right, so let's now consider the second myth, the verbal short-term store myth. And here's the original quote from the modern textbook that I read. I'll read part of it again. Atkinson and Shiffrin created a mathematical simulation of their model, concentrating on the processes involved in the rote rehearsal of verbal items. And that's the second problem I have with the way it's being characterized before we go on to the problems with their model. So let's consider this in a little more depth. So the textbook goes on to say this is the problem. Shallis and Warrington described a patient who appeared to have a grossly defective verbal short-term store, a digit span of 2, can only hold 2 items, and no recency effect. So basically no verbal short-term store. According to the modal model, Atkinson-Shiffrin model, the short-term store plays a crucial role in transferring information into and out of long-term memory. This short-term memory deficit should therefore lead to greatly impaired long-term learning in such patients. There must be something else, something in addition to that verbal short-term store. Otherwise, how could this patient get any information in the long-term store? And he's not like patient HM or EP. He can get information into long-term store. And so this is why one of the reasons why Baddeley came up with what we now call working memory, consisting of not just a verbal short-term store, but also a visual short-term store called the visual spatial sketchpad. We've got the phonological loop, the verbal, and the visual spatial sketchpad, the visual short-term store. It's a multi-component short-term store, which we now call working memory, which also includes the central executive. And this is often presented as contradicting the Atkinson-Shiffrin model. But let's look at this illustration from the Atkinson-Shiffrin chapter in 1968. In particular, the middle panel there, short-term store. And on the left box, it says, or to the left anyway, auditory, verbal, linguistic. That's what they focused on, verbal short-term memory. But look at these blank boxes there for their short-term store. What they're representing there is a multi-component short-term store, not a singular verbal short-term store. And they made it very clear that the verbal short-term store is just what they're going to focus on in this chapter. Here's what they said. Restricting the term short-term store to the auditory verbal linguistic mode does not imply that there are not other short-term memories with similar properties. And they, as I'll show you in a second, they go on to talk about visual short-term store too, as Baddeley would later do. And they even talked about possibly other kinds of short-term store like olfactory, other sensory modalities. It's not a single component short-term store consisting only of verbal memories. That's not what they proposed. That's just what they chose to further investigate. Let's continue reading from their chapter. The second basic component of our system is the short-term store. This store may be regarded as the subject's working memory. They literally use the term working memory. They are, in fact, the first to use it to refer to what we now refer to today when we use the phrase working memory, a multi-component short-term store. The phrase had been used before, that's true, but this is the first time it was used the way we use it today. And they write this: if the word cow is presented, for example, the sound of the word cow will enter short-term store. That's verbal short-term store. In addition, associates of cow, like milk, may be retrieved from long-term store, that's semantic associate, and also entered into short-term store. It's kind of like deep semantic processing can happen. But this is the key line. Furthermore, an image of a cow may be entered into a short-term visual store. So they're talking about other kinds of short-term store that can be used to get information into long-term store right in their original chapter. So to summarize this, they were the first to propose a multi-component view of short-term store consisting of a verbal store and a separate visual store. They were also the first to describe the system in terms of working memory. So later developments having to do with verbal and visual short-term stores and the working memory system, while those later developments are often presented as contradicting the model, again, actually are confirming what they proposed in the 1968 chapter. It's the opposite, and I just think the record should be corrected going forward. And so my take-home message: Atkinson and Shiffrin proposed a general theory of memory, one that provided a framework for implementing and testing more specific models. The fact that they focus on verbal short-term store is just, one specific model that they implemented, not their entire theory. They then implemented that model involving verbal short-term store to investigate the duration lengthening process of rehearsal, as well as many additional issues that laid the foundation for later models, and many additional issues that nobody talks about. So today I'm focusing on the things that people do talk about and get wrong, but there's a lot in there that nobody talks about, like for example, search of long-term memory and set size effects in long-term memory, list length effects, things like that, things that would later be addressed by models like SAM, and actually some of my own early research into memory was on that exact topic. Foundation can be found in this chapter, but nobody talks about that. But my focus today is on the things they do talk about and get wrong. And that exemplar model, the one that they implemented to investigate various issues, including the duration lengthening process, has been misunderstood as a model of rote verbal rehearsal, as if that's the theory they're proposing, and it overshadowed the contemporary theory that they actually propose. That's a point I'm making today. People miss that. Maybe not originally, but nowadays. And so it occurred to me something should be done about that, as I said at the beginning, that it makes sense that the field's most influential paper should be characterized accurately going forward. So I wrote to the editor of Journal of Memory and Language suggesting that, explaining this problem and saying that, I'd like to write an essay sort of outlining the points that I made in my talk today, and it would be peer reviewed and all that, but it would explain how the model is often mischaracterized, so that it'll be characterized more accurately going forward. And in addition, the chapter itself, maybe it should be reprinted so that it's all in modern typeset, modern font, beautiful text, easy to read and easy to find in the Journal of Memory and Language. So that people will read it, which they're clearly not doing now. At least I believe that explains the illusion of knowing that is so pervasive among textbook writers and others. And so here's my essay. It came out in 2024, and here's the chapter itself. Human memory, a proposed system and its control processes. But now, in all modern typeset and modern font, easy to read, published in the Journal of Memory and Language. And if you have some time on your hands in the near future, I recommend that you not do what I did. Don't wait so late in your career before finally reading this chapter. Take some time to read it. You're going to find a lot more in there, a lot more interesting and important information than you might think from reading about what textbooks have to say about it. Okay, thank you very much.